Hello, I'm Michael Hainsworth. Welcome back from the summer break. While the politicians have been on holiday, the Institute was hard at work cracking the code on how to improve Canada's productivity. Since the mid-1980s, U.S. labor productivity has grown 100%. By comparison, Canada's labor productivity has risen just 40%. So why are Canadians only 70% as productive as their American counterparts? Hint, it has nothing to do with the exchange rate. Meet Michelle Alexopoulos and Jeremy Kronick. Alexopoulos is a member of the C.D. Howe Institute's Business Cycle Council and a professor of economics at the University of Toronto. Jeremy Kronick is an associate VP at the Institute and director of the Centre on Financial and Monetary Policy. They join us now. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Mike.
Thank you.
Michelle, what are the primary barriers that are preventing Canadian workers from reaching the same productivity levels as their American counterparts?
Well, I think that the first thing that we have to acknowledge is it's not just one factor. We have multiple factors here that are at work and have been for a number of years. I think when we think about issues with productivity, you're talking about issues about differences in competitiveness between the different environments in Canada and the United States, things like trade barriers, and also our willingness to take risks and really get new technologies into the hands of firms and workers in a timely fashion. And those things actually translate that into lags with our American neighbors, and sometimes us not getting the full bang for the buck, as you might refer to it as, when actually bringing in the new technologies and new processes into the workplace.
Jeremy, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think Michelle's bang on that it's not just one thing, interprovincial trade barriers, regulatory barriers, major project uncertainty in terms of the time it takes to get those projects approved. And you can see it in our SMEs and how we turn them into large companies. We often hear that SMEs are the backbone in Canada, and they are, 90% of the workforce, 95% of the businesses. But the flip side of that is you're not turning those SMEs into large businesses. And it's those large businesses where you get the kind of scale that leads to the kind of productivity gains that we're looking for. And so, drilling down and thinking about why that's happening, I think is really key here.
Well, let's drill into this. But first, if interprovincial trade barriers, excessive regulation, difficulties in commercializing even university research all contribute to the lag, which of these factors, Jeremy, does the Institute see as the primary one that needs to be addressed first, even though we're not going to just start at the top and work our way down? They all need to be addressed simultaneously.
Yeah, I think, Michael, that's where it's difficult. I don't know that you put an order to these things. I think you kind of have to look at it all and chip away where you can. So, there have been some studies that have come up within the Bank of Canada, the IMF, those kinds of respected institutions, that these interprovincial trade barriers, for example, are 4 to 7% of GDP. That's a huge number. It's $150 billion. So if you could get at that would be great. But that's been a fight we've been fighting for many, many, many decades here. And so you want to chip away at that where you can, but you got to look at the other places that you can also take a step at. So, for example, in the financial sector, open banking sounds like something that has nothing to do with productivity, except that we don't have a ton of depth to capital markets here in Canada. And open banking, in theory, creates more competition in the financial sector. For issuing that debt, and that could lead to a more competitive, prosperous country. So there's things like that you can look to see where there are opportunities, but it really is going to take looking at a number of different areas.
Michelle, what about the interprovincial trade barriers issue? As Jeremy points out, this is not a new conversation. We've been having it for years. How do we get the provinces to start thinking as a federation as opposed to individual islands?
Well, this is a thing where I believe that the public and being actually informed about what's going on will actually play a very large role. I'm not sure, as Jeremy said, when people think about things like open banking or hear this, they don't really understand that there are a lot of, threads that go through the economy that if you at least were able to sort of break down some of the barriers, it's going to have real impact for them in their wages, in their opportunities at home. And so I think that sometimes when you're talking about different special interest groups that are backing up some of the interprovincial trade barriers and everything like that, the politicians aren't dealing with it in part because individuals haven't really realized the size of these particular barriers and the costs actually to them. When we think about inflation, it's easy. People see the numbers, they're seeing the impact initially in their pocketbook. But when you're actually talking about things like interprovincial trade barriers, it's a few steps back, right, in terms of what it's costing, in terms of the prices of your goods, or whether or not you are an individual who can only practice within certain jurisdictions because of the different barriers to moving your trade across different jurisdictions, right? So there's lots of different forms that the interprovincial trade barriers actually come in, right? Everything from different kinds of regulations, as we said, to licensing, to even a restriction of movement between jurisdictions. But as Jeremy said, we're talking about anywhere from like 4 to 7% of GDP. That's the total economic output in the Canadian economy. Those numbers are huge, and it is something that I think if everybody understood, right, then I think then the politicians would probably be put into a situation where it would come higher up in terms of the list of things that we need to start really digging into and dealing with.
It sounds like what you're saying is many of the solutions, particularly on interprovincial trade, are less policy-oriented and more political-oriented. If certain trade groups have helped elect a particular premier, maybe that premier is less likely in the negotiating room to ease off on those types of policies.
Well, maybe I could jump in there because I think there's two things at play. I think certainly the politics is part of it, and it's not, it's about who's putting that kind of pressure on the political side of it, right? I mean, the average person may not be thinking, I'm going to call my NPP and say, I'm tired of paying these extra fees for importing a used car from one province to another. But that's exactly what needs to happen to kind of put that pressure on it. But we shouldn't say that there's not, policy stuff as well that you could do around this stuff. I mean, there's been a lot of ideas floated. The Institute's floated some ideas out there. There's one where you could use the tax system. So the feds could lower their take of the taxes and allow the provinces to increase their taxes, the tax intake that they take, as long as they reduce some of these barriers. So a little bit of incentivizing in order to allow more revenue to flow to the provinces via the tax system. They can use that how they see fit. So there's some really good policy ideas that you could combine with the politics. But certainly, as we know in today's society, the people have to get on board and be putting pressure on in order to bring issues to the top of the list.
And I'd like to just add one thing here too. I don't think that it's just the special interest groups collecting money to elect particular governments. I think there's always a lot of different policy pieces on a political agenda. And it's just these ones, because they're not sort of front and center for people, sometimes just don't get discussed. And therefore, we have things that are on the books for a very, very long time period. And it's not been clear, I guess, in terms of how do we get the discussion to be around clearing some of these things off. And quite often, as Jeremy said, it's not just a conversation for the politicians of the province, but this is like sort of multi-step, right? We definitely have different levels of government that are going to need to engage in this conversation because it is going to affect the different kinds of revenues that are coming in. And in fact, even the development of, some of the cities at the municipal level as to what kind of talent and infrastructure and stuff you'll need if things are actually wiped away in terms of the barriers. And we actually do have some extra opportunities and growth happening in different jurisdictions.
I wonder if I've gone down a bit of a rabbit hole on the interprovincial trade barriers, because we talk about them being an issue, yet at the same time, the Americans have 5 times more the number of individual states that they would have to deal with versus us in provinces, and their productivity is substantially higher than ours. What are they doing right that we need to adopt?
I guess I think of it differently because the U.S. is its own beast, right? It's a large economy. It has so many inherent advantages that we don't have here in Canada. So we have to think a little bit about, we have to come back to what we can do. And I agree, we shouldn't just focus on interprovincial trade barriers. So what are some of the other things that we can do, right? How do we, for example, think about scaling up our businesses? So, just as an example, the U.S. put in under Obama Small Businesses Jobs Act, where if you hold certain qualifying shares in small businesses for a period of 5 years and you sell those shares, you don't have to pay capital gains taxes on those shares. So that's the kind of idea that we could look to implement something similar here in Canada that might, provide more of that kind of capital, that kind of finance that we're talking about to SMEs that would allow them to scale, right? And there's a whole bunch of stuff, similar things that, other countries do around liquidity events, for example. So an IPO, where again, if you put that revenue from that IPO back into the R&D of your business within a 2-year period, you don't pay capital gains. So what are the kinds of ideas like that we can look elsewhere to think about that would help scale up our businesses, which again, as great as the SMEs are, where you see the big productivity gains is when those small companies achieve the kind of scale that they get when they become large companies. So what are those kinds of ideas?
So I think I'd agree with Jeremy on a lot of these things. The Americans, I mean, there's a blessing and a curse to being next door neighbors to one of the largest economies, obviously, in the world and one of the most dynamic. And because of the size, I mean, remember, all of Canada together, you could probably put it into the same kind of category as California, right? I mean, so we're like aggregated together, the number of people and stuff that we have is more like a huge American state. So, when we have extra barriers inside, that's potentially more problematic. But it's also then harder to scale things also because there's this draw for some of our talents to be sucked into opportunities that are south of the border that actually do deal with tax systems in a slightly different way, where the return to their investment may be larger for a number of reasons, capital gains being obviously one of them. But even income levels for personal wages and everything like that can be much different south of the border as opposed to here at home. Now, when looking at these things, and it's not just growing our SMEs, right? But it's also making sure that the technologies are coming and being adopted. And the other thing that we sort of see, and this is why I had mentioned competition before, is that competition is a little bit different here in Canada for some of our key industries, things like banking, things like telecommunications. And that also ends up being sort of a hindrance to firms deciding that I need to, try to adopt the latest technologies in order to compete with my firm competitor here in our jurisdiction. So it's a much larger conversation, I think, outside of the trade barriers. And it also depends on what part of the ecosystem we're talking about, right? It's not just growing the existing firms, but it's also making sure that in a dynamic environment where we've got AI coming and advances where, the technological landscape is changing, that we're going to want new businesses formed here that are going to stay and grow and be very prosperous to create high-paying jobs for Canadians and giving that revenue stream. You want that to happen here at home and not have basically startups here that end up going for the larger market because they don't have the proper funding patterns and everything here to actually flourish at home.
To the point about small to medium-sized enterprises having difficulty scaling, I thought programs like the Shred were designed to help encourage those companies to invest in the necessary equipment, in the necessary technologies to make those employees more productive, make them more capable of competing on the world stage. Have we just simply not done enough with that? Do we need to do more with it? Have we misused that program?
I think the Shred program, there's some elements of it that have gone well, some elements that haven't gone well. It's not so much, so my view is a little bit different than maybe some of the mainstream thought on this. I think it's less about, technology investment and building that technology and more about the commercialization of those ideas. And for SMEs in Canada to grow, as Michelle said, the entire Canadian economy is quite small. It's basically one big US state. And so that's a small market that you have right off the bat if you're only looking domestically. And when you're a small business, it's hard to already be thinking globally off the bat, right? And so but in some ways you do if you want to grow and scale into the kind of companies that we're talking about with these productivity gains. So I think it's about how do we commercialize ideas in Canada? This is my view. How do we commercialize those ideas? And how do we get companies thinking about market size off the bat and not just when they sort of, grow to a certain size? And because by that point, it can be hard to do those kinds of things. So it's not, to me, it's more about that commercialization than the Shred program itself.
All right, very diplomatic answer. Michelle, what's yours?
I think really Jeremy's right on these environments, but I think also when we're talking about commercialization, there's commercialization and then there's getting the adoption, right? And I think, some of the Shred programs, everything will help with a little bit of the adoption, but it's not only about money at the end of the day, right? And I mean, there is, certain people will tell you maybe the size and the pots aren't quite large enough. Other people would say maybe, the government, wants to be careful about how we sort of incentivize particular things and whether the money is really going quite the way we want to in the right spots. But overall, I think this is a larger conversation that goes just beyond a particular government program. As we said, if we have uncertainty in things like regulatory environments going forward about new technologies and innovations, if we come up with this great, and Mars has a bunch of, different companies and incubator stage that deal even with things like medical technologies. Think about what has to happen here in Canada to even get a code to allow you to bill across all of the different jurisdictions just to commercialize that particular technology here at home. So it's not just about the money in this environment. We have to look at these things as a whole package, right, in order to get that commercialization and the adoption really under more or given more fire and gasoline to really promote it here at home in Canada.
Michelle, you touched on something a little bit earlier, and I want to circle back to it. You've written in the past for the Institute alongside Jeremy that from 1994 to mid-2024, Canadian productivity and real wages grew by about 35%. What do you see as the relationship between productivity and wage stagnation in Canada?
Well, our productivity has been pretty lackluster, and that automatically means that when you're thinking about profits and everything here in Canada, there's going to be a smaller pie to split between capital payments and wages for workers. So what we want to do is we want to make sure that, as we get the productivity booms, that those workers are going to be able to benefit from working with technology, working in a more dynamic corporation or for a small firm that's going to have the profits that are going to allow that to be distributed to people. So I think it is a very strong link between productivity and wages. And this is well beyond a conversation about unionization or who has bargaining power in this. It really has to do with productivity, which is the efficiency in which we take inputs and turn them into outputs. That's the closest thing that economists often think we have for a free lunch, okay? It basically will drive growth, it will drive the size of the pot, and eventually, with the rising tide, we hope everybody's wages will be able to go up with this coming through. So I do think that the lackluster productivity that we had has really been a key factor in holding wages down.
And Michael, if possible, I'll just add on top of that what Michelle said, which I agree with completely. But just we used an example, in that piece that you mentioned. I'll change the example a little bit. But if a firm was producing 100 computers, with a set of costs, and all of a sudden now can produce 1,000 computers with those exact same costs, they are by nature or by arithmetic more profitable, right? And so that should lead to higher wages. But even if that firm didn't want to do that, didn't want to increase the wages, that increased efficiency ought to make for more competition, right? It makes it easier now in theory for other firms to come in and to compete to produce computers, and they can offer higher wages to attract that talent. So that's where that sort of link between the two, comes together, and you can really see it in the data, over time in not just Canada, in a lot of countries, but obviously, for our purposes, Canada is what was of interest for us.
And so that's why, just adding on again to what Jeremy's saying, if we're limiting the type of technology that we're using here at home, where firms don't want to adopt it because they're uncertain about the regulations that are going to come forward, or we don't have as much competition here, there's not that same incentive to get that kick that's going to help spread the wealth from adopting the technology and getting that paid back, I guess, to both labor and capital investments.
So then, Michelle, let's come full circle back here to the point you made earlier about how we are now seeing new technologies enter the market. Artificial intelligence is a perfect example of that. Canada is considered a world leader in the research on AI and things of that nature. Yet very few Canadians today could argue they understand AI and the role it will have in their careers moving forward. How significant is generally, whether it be AI or otherwise, a skills mismatch in Canada?
That's a very good question. It's actually one that's a little bit hard to answer because we don't have really fantastic measures of skill mismatch, okay? If you think about sort of the general economy, you're just looking at the type of education you'd need to be, holding certain types of jobs. Maybe you're talking about skill mismatch in Canada being around, 13, 14%, maybe as low as 12. But in terms of rapid technical change, right, we're talking about like a bachelor's is not a bachelor's, is not a bachelor's. I mean, you actually have a lot of different skills that sort of go on. And so a bachelor's in English may not be the same as a bachelor in computer science when dealing with some of the new technologies. But the truth is, because AI is often thought of to be the next big sort of general purpose technology, which is going to change the way all of us interact with it, skills are going to be increasingly important, right? And being agile with the skill set, that's what I tell my kids, being agile with the skill set and making sure, that you sort of at least learn some of the basics. And by basics, I mean just sort of understand what it's capable of doing and what it's not capable of doing, right? Is going to actually help the workforce in a large way. We have to also think about immigration in a sensible way when we're dealing with the types of technological change. And when you refer to skill mismatch, one way of taking a look at skill mismatch is also to have good vacancy numbers and understanding what the postings are that individuals are saying they need in terms of talent, and where things are basically not being filled for large portions. So that means that when we're thinking about productivity, it's not just barriers today, right? I mean, we have to be looking forward, looking at seeing where things are actually evolving and planning for it. And some of that's going to be through the education systems at the universities. We're going to have to think about sensible ways of reskilling and retraining people. And some of that's going to have to be done sort of, I think, in-house in some of the larger firms. And in other ones, there's going to be different kinds of certificates and everything that are already coming to the marketplace that people can actually get some training on these particular dimensions. But it'll be important, an important conversation, not just now, but going forward.
And maybe I'll add something that might be a bit tangential, but I thought of it as Michelle was talking. We've talked a lot about labor productivity, and we wrote that piece. We talked about labor productivity. But we can also think about total factor productivity, which brings in capital as well, right, into the story. And if you look there, and it's true of labor productivity too, but if you look at total factor productivity, you really need to look through the sectors, right, that have changed in the last 30, 40 years and what's happened to their productivity levels and growth. In terms of thinking about how all these technologies are going to play a role in those different sectors, right? Like where are these sectors on their, innovation, technology growth, adaptation path? And what is that likely to mean given where they have been over the last 10, 20, 30 years? And thinking about investment, Canada, the Institute's written a lot on Canada's poor record when it comes to investment in capital. And so the labor's key, but we got to think about the capital too. We got to think about the different sectors and where they are in their journey too.
And I think I'll just add to that, if I might, and that has to do with, when we say people don't understand or see the clear path, I mean, the waters are very muddy right now. The individuals, the technology is evolving rapidly. Some firms are exploring different pieces of it and how to adopt it. But the truth is we're already behind in Canada. As you said, we are leaders or among the leaders in terms of the research component. But again, the adoption and the commercialization of this is actually much lower here in Canada already than it is in the United States. That's not a new pattern. We saw that with the computers coming in, and as we basically looked at ICT type technologies, we've always been about 2 years behind the Americans in a lot of ways. Now, again, we tend, because of the lack of or different sets of competitions and everything like that, I don't think it's the workers, right, in this case. I think that there are a lot of factors in the Canadian economy that means we're just slightly more willing to wait. We are a little bit less dynamic and willing to take chances. Some of that can come from the tax system. As we said, some of that can come from the regulations. If you're a small and medium-sized firm, you say, look, are you going to bet the house on this brand new technology? Probably the answer is going to be no, right? So even the size of our firms are going to play a role in here. But I think it's really important, when we're sort of thinking about this, to realize all of the factors that are coming into play across these different industries. We can look and learn from the individuals to the south, but then we want to have it so that we adopt it as soon as we can, as soon as we see gains for that.
If there was one thing you want the viewer to walk away from this conversation with, what would it be?
I think it's important for the viewers to start realizing the impact that productivity has on their income, on their standards of living, and become educated on this, become involved. Realize that when the political environments and discussions pop out, as they will in the next elections, that you want to be listening to make sure that our elected representatives are taking care of the issues at hand, that Canadians will be able to prosper and grow with the incoming new technologies that are coming along for the betterment of our society and our economy.
Well, I don't think it's fair that Michelle got to go first. No, I'm not sure I have a time to add. But here, let me start with something that I think is important. Productivity does not mean working harder, right? And I think sometimes when people hear the word productivity, they think, oh, I need to work harder. And it's not about that. It's an efficiency story. Can you produce more with the same amount of input, the same amount of effort, the same amount of capital? And if you can do that, well, then you can scale it up. You can hire more people. You can bring in more, machines to do the work, and you can create more output. And by doing that, we're going to get a bigger pie that we can then all share.
We want people to work smarter, not necessarily harder on this. And productivity is the way that we're going to do that. It's the change in efficiency. And so we want to make sure that anything that's blocking the efficiency is actually peeled away where it can be.
Thank you both so much for your time and your insight today.
Thank you.
Michelle Alexopoulos is a member of the C.D. Howe Institute's Business Cycle Council and a professor of economics at the University of Toronto. Jeremy Kronick is an associate VP at the Institute and director of the Centre on Financial and Monetary Policy. For further insight into Canada's productivity problem, read the latest on our website at cdhowe.org. And subscribe on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts for walking the dog or that commute to work. I'm Michael Hainsworth. Thanks for joining us.
You've been listening to the C.D. Howe Institute podcast with Michael Hainsworth. Subscribe on iTunes, Google Play, and Spotify. The C.D. Howe Institute is an independent, not-for-profit research institute whose mission is to raise living standards by fostering economically sound public policies. The Institute is widely considered to be Canada's most influential think tank and a trusted source of essential policy intelligence, distinguished by nonpartisan, evidence-based research and subject to definitive expert review. Visit cdhowe.org and follow us on Twitter and LinkedIn. Thank you.